Welcome to Georgetown and to this panel discussion, Left Behind, Working Class Families and Communities. My name is Joe McCartan. I'm the Executive Director of the commentators Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor here at Georgetown. And the commentators Initiative, the KI, is delighted to join the Baker Center for Leadership and Governance at the Institute of Politics and Public Service in the McCourt School of Public Policy in co-sponsoring this panel tonight, which is hosted and really led by Georgetown University's Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life. The Commentators Initiative was founded in 2009 to direct the resources of this university toward the study of and the creation of solutions for the problems that afflict the working poor and our efforts to win justice and dignity on the job. When we look back, we are likely to remember, I think, two things about 2016, and I say that as a historian also in my other work here at Georgetown. I think we're likely to remember this year for two things. First, if polls can be trusted, we will probably remember this as the year that the United States elected its first woman president. A president who will likely be elected with the aid, again, if polls are to be trusted, of a huge gender gap in voting, and amidst a long overdue national conversation about gender inequality and the pervasiveness of sexual assault. But we are also likely to remember this year for another reason. This year, we are likely to remember was the year when populist politics and rhetoric emerged with force perhaps not seen since the days of the Populist Party in the 1890s. This has been a year when growing inequality, job insecurity, a sense that economic forces operated on behalf of the few and at the expense of the many, a sense that the system is rigged in favor of ruling elites. When all of these sentiments burst forth into our national politics in a powerful and often unexpected way. The events of this year have reminded us that populism is nothing if not a malleable ideology and political style. Populist anger at the rule of the 1% fueled the candidacy of Bernie Sanders and has arguably pushed the Democratic Party and its standard-bearer, Hillary Clinton, further to the left than that party and its standard-bearer have been in a generation. Populist anger directed at media elites, established party leaders, and those perceived to be culturally alien, meanwhile, has fueled the candidacy of Donald Trump. Although Trump and Sanders could not be more different in style and substance, they have both marshaled populistic messages in an effort to appeal to those who will be the subject of our discussion tonight, the nation's working class, or as the filmmaker Michael Moore has recently taken to calling them, the former middle class. These are people who have suffered and whose lives and futures have grown increasingly insecure over the past generation. Their employers, in many cases, have betrayed them, automating, outsourcing, and subcontracting their jobs. The nation's weakened union movement has proven largely unable to protect them. After all, only 6% of the nation's private sector workers are now in unions. Government policies have also failed them. Our labor laws are now older than anyone who serves in a position of power in the Congress or the courts. The Wagner Act was passed in 1935 and hasn't been significantly modernized since. Efforts to modernize our labor laws have consistently met with gridlock. Meanwhile, working class families have seen their incomes remain largely stagnant across both Republican and Democratic administrations. Dealing with the problems of these Americans is bound to be high on the agenda of the next president and the next Congress. But how to deal with those problems? What are the source of those problems? And how can we best address them? This will be the subject of tonight's discussion. The Kalmanovitz Initiative is proud to co-sponsor this event. We view it as central to our mission to help promote discussions like this that address the issues of working people and promote solutions. We do that through events like this, through programs we offer to our students. We also do it through one of the most important blogs on these issues that one can find in this country today, edited by folks affiliated with our KI initiative here at Georgetown, John Russo and Sherry Lincoln. If John, you and Sherry just raise your hand so people know who you are. They edit a blog called Working Class Perspectives, and in recent months, John has been widely interviewed by people around the world really seeking to understand what's going on with the American working class. That seems to be evident in this election. If you'd like to subscribe to that blog, just let us know before you leave tonight. We now would like to turn the proceedings over to my colleague, John Carr, and just a word before I do that. John came here to Georgetown just a few years ago to lead our new initiative on Catholic social thought and public life. John did that after spending a career working for the nation's bishops for many years as their top social policy advisor. He's grappled with these issues for a long time. And since he's come to Georgetown, he's really developed a way of convening really searching discussions of the issues that are really central to our time, and doing that in a way that reaches across ideological barriers and boundaries, and that really promotes civility and a true interchange of ideas. And that's the sort of evening he has planned for us tonight. Before I turn it over to him, I should say one thing. We didn't intend that this would all be men here. I alluded a moment ago to the fact that we're very well aware of gender dynamics as well as class dynamics that are playing out in this election. We had originally scheduled Cleola Brown of the A. Philip Randolph Institute to be part of this panel. She had to drop out suddenly, and we weren't able to secure a woman to replace her. So we didn't intend for it to be like this. But this, I think, maybe gives us a good opportunity to talk about gender issues as we get the discussion going. And certainly there'll be an opportunity for all of us here to weigh in with our questions and comments as we go. And with that, let me turn it over to my good friend and colleague, John Carr. John?
Hello. Hello. They say the way you can tell you're at a Catholic meeting is there's no one in the front row and the audio visuals never work. Hopefully we'll break both those barriers tonight. Thanks very much to Joe. Thanks to the Baker Center, our colleagues in this. Many of you know Joe, and you've seen Joe is a remarkable leader here at Georgetown. He's a historian, he's a bridge builder, he's a leader, he's a collaborator. No one has been more gracious in welcoming us to Georgetown. And when people ask sometimes if Georgetown is serious about its Catholic identity and Jesuit values, I think you can point to KI and Joe and his colleagues as a great example of putting Catholic social teaching to work. So we're honored to be with him. The initiative is happy to be a part of this. We do a number of things. We reach out to young leaders. We convene major gatherings. But tonight, we really go to part of our core mission, which is creating civil dialogue at the intersection of Catholic social thought and public life. And you can't talk about Catholic social thought without beginning with the dignity of work and the rights of workers. I'm teaching a seminar this year. Pray for those students. Pray for me. Grades are coming. And I had them reread, and I reread Rerum Novarum. And sadly, some of the language is a little stuffy, but the reality it describes is still very real, very present in our work. I remember when we did the poverty panel here, Tim's boss, Arthur Brooks, was a part of the panel with President Obama. Professor Robert Putnam talked about what's happening in working class communities and the loss of social supports, the loss of economic resources, but most of all, the loss of hope. And it's terrible consequences for all of us, but especially what he called our kids. We had a session before the Bishop's Synod, the Roman Synod, and we called it, it's the Economy Synod, reminding people that the stresses on family life, and we had Rich Trumpka from the AFL-CIO, and then we just had a session on faith, anger, and trust in this campaign, and we asked who was angry. And it turns out the answer was a lot of people who have felt left behind in this economy and in this country. We've lost 5 million manufacturing jobs in 15 years. Wages are stagnant, and maybe the greatest deficit is a sense of hope and opportunity and optimism. And many of our major institutions have failed working class families and communities. We'll talk about the church. But our two political parties, I think, in some ways have become enthralled with two different kinds of individualism. I'm from a bipartisan, a mixed marriage family. My mother was Republican, my dad Democrat. She would remind me that some Republicans, not all, view the market as the measure of everything. And there's sort of an economic individualism that doesn't leave much room for what we're talking about tonight. And in the Democratic Party, my dad would remind me, some Democrats seem to have gone for a sort of identity individualism that lifts up culture war issues. While the rhetoric is one of economic justice, many of the priorities are around culture war issues. Planned Parenthood seems to have a lot more clout than immigration groups or the AFL-CIO. In the Republican Party, they talk about culture war issues, but the results have been tax cuts for the rich and seemingly endless war in the Middle East. So neither of those approaches leave much room for the poor, the working class, or the common good. I'm reminded that when he was here, it's only a year ago, a little more than a year ago, it seems this campaign makes everything seem much longer. Pope Francis said, I want to talk to the many thousands of men and women who strive each day to do an honest day's work, to bring home their daily bread, to save money, and one step at a time, to build a better life for their families. These are the men and women who are not concerned simply with paying their taxes, but in their own quiet ways sustain the life of society. They generate solidarity. Well, the solidarity that Pope Francis talked about that day is too often missing in American life, and especially missing in the treatment of working class families and community who have been left behind. So we're going to have a discussion tonight. We'll begin with some general introductions and a general question, and then we'll go deeper. We're very pleased to have Tim Carney, who's a senior political columnist for the Washington Examiner and a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Bill Fletcher is a senior scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies. He's a media commentator. He actually has to leave 5 minutes early to get on a show he's a part of. He has been a strong leader in the labor movement and the African American community for justice. Kiley is a priest of the Archdiocese of Chicago, a White Sox fan. Told me solidarity now sends to the Cubs. I think that shows a certain lack of principle on his part. But he is a visiting fellow at the Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies at Catholic University, and he works on immigration policy for Unite Higher, and he was a colleague of mine at the Bishops' Conference. And Thomas Frank is a political analyst, columnist. He's written several amazing books, What's the Matter with Kansas, and his new book, Listen Liberal. He's written for the Wall Street Journal, Harper's, and he's the editor of Baffler. So I'd like to start with you, Tom, and just ask a general question. You can choose from among these themes. What are the facts, trends, and dimensions of an economy that leaves working class families and communities behind? And what are the political impacts of the anger and frustration which results from this and has fed the Trump and Sanders challenge to the status quo? And if you want to go further, what are the costs, not only economic, but moral and human costs of that kind of economy? And we'll just go down the row.
Well, I want you to start with somebody else. I'm not the statistics guy.
Okay. Well, Tim?
Sure. Thank you for having me. Thank all of you for coming. The fact is that inequality, by many measures, is rising. That you've had the stock market hitting record high, you have corporate profits hitting record high, yet you have median wages stagnating. There's lots of different ways to measure inequality and to look at it. But I think, and I'm going to jump to the second half of your question, which is what are the costs, to say, what is the worst sort of inequality? I think you have to look at the second half, the last third of the book Coming Apart by my AEI colleague Charles Murray. Marriage inequality, by which I mean the wealthy are continuing to get married. The elites see that marriage is a good thing, yet marriage is falling off in the working class. Church attendance, that is another place where you see the divergence. Any way you can measure the strength of community, that's falling off. Work, obviously, and satisfaction with work is falling off. So I think if you wanted to get the right numbers, the right statistics, you can look at wage inequality or wealth inequality or the divergence of the stock market and median wages. I think the best place to look is the fact that the elites, those of us in the bubble, are continuing to get married, live in strong communities, have satisfying work, and frankly attend church, while in the lower class you see all of those things falling off. So you do have tons of the economic inequality, but the concomitant social inequality, for me, is the more troubling problem.
Okay. Thomas, let me go in a different direction. Your first book really examined sort of the Republican base and whether how the Republican Party was leading or misleading them. Your new book challenges the Democratic establishment. One of the lines I remember, you said, they've traded the principle of solidarity for the principle of competitive individualism and meritocracy. What does it mean to have a party that, as you said, used to be the party of the people, go down this road where professionalism, expertise, education is the coin of the realm, not work, community, and family?
Okay. So I have this feeling that by the way, howdy, how are y'all doing? It's great to be here in Washington, D.C. I think my microphone is up way too high. Can you hear? It's like echoing and reverberating. No? All right then. So one of the more intriguing facts about inequality is the way that it increases regardless of whether a Republican or a Democrat sits in the White House, and in fact has hit all-time highs by certain measurements with Barack Obama himself sitting in the Oval. And this is a man that we're constantly told is the most liberal of all possible presidents. And you look at the presidency of, this is how I start Listen Liberal, is you're looking at the presidency of Barack Obama and trying to address one of the great mysteries, I think, of his presidency, and I think historians will be debating about this for the rest of our century, which is why did he, when he was in the first 2 years of his presidency, when he had the perfect opportunity to deal with the banking system in this country, why did he choose the course that he did, where he didn't break up any Wall Street banks, and he didn't unwind any bailouts, and he didn't fire any of the top management? He did at GM, but not at, In fact, the Bush administration was more eager to fire, they fired the management at AIG, but Obama didn't do any of that sort of thing. And this is the question. And so it becomes a study of the Democratic Party itself. Why has the Democratic Party failed to address these questions? And what you find when you start looking, the answer becomes obvious very quickly, is that they aren't who we think they are. This isn't the party of working people, regardless of the nice things that Hillary Clinton says from time to time. This is a party that identifies with the professional class. And when I say that they are a party of the professional class, I mean this in almost a 19th century way, that they have, the Democratic Party acts as the agent or the tribune of this class of people. You have class and you have party. Every other member of or most other members of the Democratic coalition are basically there because they have nowhere else to go, right? That this is the best deal they're going to get. But the professional class is served very well by these guys. Now, what does this tell us about the Democratic? And by the way, this is not me like reading between the lines or trying to be clever about the Democratic Party. This is me reading their magazines, their books, their sort of the literature of the Democratic Party. They're very open about this. They made this choice deliberately in the early 1970s, and they have stuck with it through thick and thin, increasingly since then. What I mean by that, jettisoning the labor movement, jettisoning working people, and turning their attention to the professional class. Now, the professional class is a high status class. Okay, so this is a form of liberalism that is concerned with winners, concerned with the winners specifically in our post-industrial economy. Okay, it's a liberalism of the rich, is the way I think about it. And I know you started off by asking me about solidarity, and I will come around to that, but this is a party that believes very profoundly in the idea of meritocracy. Not an Ayn Rand kind of meritocracy where it's defined by how hard you work and you climb up through the corporation or whatever, and you make your way in the business world. It's a different kind of meritocracy, a meritocracy that is based on how you did in school, your educational achievement, a sort of hierarchy of status, okay? And this is something that the Democratic Party respects profoundly, and they believe in that kind of meritocracy. So the first thing you learn when you study the sociology of the professional class and its great faith in meritocracy is that there is no solidarity in a meritocracy. There is no the professional class has real troubles with the very concept of solidarity. Now look at this in two ways. You can see amazing kind of solidarity at the top, say between the Obama's Treasury Department and the guys at JP Morgan, right? They are they go through back and forth through the revolving door. These are peers. These are classmates. These are people that really see eye to eye. Go back and look at Hillary's speeches to Goldman or to Morgan Stanley or whatever it is. But they feel very little solidarity towards people in their same discipline who happen to be lower down in the hierarchy. There is no sort of hierarchy between high and low, because everyone's, the baseline doctrine of meritocracy is that you get what you deserve, and what you deserve is defined by how you did in school. And folks, I have personal experience of this. I have all sorts of examples, and Listen Liberal is filled with hundreds of examples of what I'm describing, a liberalism of the rich, and the sort of what it means to have a politics of one of our two major parties dedicated to the well-being of a class of people, a high-status class of people. But I'm going to stop right there.
Okay. Tim, you write in the Examiner, you're affiliated with AEI. I read a piece you wrote on rural Pennsylvania, and it was one of the most powerful pieces where not only jobs have left, not only wages are down, but hope, and for that matter, religious affiliation is down. Thomas took on his party. You've taken on your party's nominee. If he wrote the book Listen Liberal, what would the book Listen Conservative sound like if you had a chance to talk to your own party about how it treats working class families and communities?
Thank you. Yeah, I will accept the mantle of being a Republican for the practical purposes here, though I joined the party just to vote against one particular New Yorker and then left the party shortly afterwards. But on this stage, I'm the Republican. I'll take that. If I were to write that book, I would say, follow me to Uniontown, Pennsylvania. The way I chose when I was going out to Pennsylvania, I wanted to pick rural white poverty because I think that is the story of this election. It's been ignored. And the way I chose Fayette County, Pennsylvania, was I found an academic who had done a study of the reduction in church attendance by county in PA, and the number one county was Fayette County. And after that, I went and I checked unemployment rate, tied for number one, Fayette County. percentage of the population on disability. Number 2, Fayette County, only behind Pennsylvania. And this is a thing that I think conservatives have trouble with, is that sometimes when they see high percentage of people on disability, they think, okay, these folks are slackers. But the fact that they're running to Donald Trump in ways that they never ran to Barack Obama, and I did find a number of sort of Obama, then sat it out in 2012, and now voting for Donald Trump voters. But I think that that says that there is an openness to a conservative argument, that these people say, look, they give us, you know, huge unemployment checks, but that just means I can't go back to work. They give us this welfare, but that means my neighbor down the street, and no matter how much assistance you're on in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, there's somebody else down the street who's a welfare case who you're going to say is lazy. But that no matter how much assistance, my neighbor down the street is going to be lazy. That they see their communities have crumbled and they don't think Washington has the answer. So I would say, listen conservative. I would say, listen conservative to the people talking in rural communities. And I'd hope it would go beyond that into not just white rural poverty, but black poverty, because the fact is, we think the liberals ruin it by having good intentions poorly applied. I think we need to have those same good intentions and then take our wisdom about about incentives and economics and frankly the dignity of work and apply those.
Okay. If you'd like to join our conversation, hashtag FaithVote at GUCST Public Life is a way to do that. FaithVote at GUCST Public Life. Tim began with white rural poverty and ended with black poverty. Bill, you've given your life to connecting work and racism and gender issues, social justice issues. I read where you started as a welder in Quincy, Massachusetts. You've been an adjunct faculty member. That's one of the groups I think Thomas was talking about that doesn't get much solidarity. You worked with John Sweeney. You were education director. You've been an organizer. You worked with Trans-Africa. You've done an awful lot. But through that whole time, you've been one who has tried to build solidarity among working and poor people. The racial dimensions of this are huge. People are talking a lot about black unemployment, about white unemployment, about white hopelessness. We have a movement that says Black Lives Matter because black people don't think their lives matter. How, as we talk about working class families and communities, how can we enlarge our vision so it's not just one race, one part of the country?
So I'm glad that the other panelists are not going to say anything else for the next hour. And that'll give me plenty of time to address this question. Let me start with this, to be a bit provocative. I think what we're looking at has nothing to do with the family or people going to church. It has to do with the fact that capitalism has been crushing people, and this wasn't supposed to happen to white people. See, that last point is really critical for us to understand, that when we talk about Uniontown, Pennsylvania, for example, then I want to talk about Camden, New Jersey. I want to talk about East St. Louis, right? I want to talk about Fall River, New Bedford, right? And these are cities that many people have completely ignored. It's almost like they were vaporized by laser cannon or something. People are not paying attention because, see, it was okay for it to happen to those populations. It wasn't supposed to happen to white people. And that is what we're seeing in this election. This is what has people really pissed off. If you look at the stats, the living standard of the average working person has been declining since roughly 1975. It has been declining. It goes back to what Thomas Frank was saying. And it has been going down. We are not in any way close to what we once were in 75. As a result, we are seeing communities destroyed. We're seeing cities turned into neo-reservations. I mean, we're in a situation, why are families breaking apart? Well, maybe it has something to do with the fact that jobs are disappearing. People are having a heck of a time surviving. They are losing faith. In other cases, entire communities are being dispersed. I mean, one of the things, if you look in Washington, D.C., is that the African Americans that were attending various churches, well, they're being pushed out of Washington, D.C. So I think we have to look at this very comprehensively. One of the questions in terms of Black Lives Matter, or thinking about it more broadly, is this: that the disproportionate impact of deindustrialization has fallen on the black working class. And there is almost no one that has raised that issue. The disproportionate impact on African American and Chicano working classes. And in this election, we're hearing about the plight of the white worker. And actually, I think we have to be very, very careful. Because when we talk about this, and we talk about who allegedly supports Donald Trump, it's not entirely clear to me that the term working class white really accurately describes who that is. The stats seem to say something else. They seem to say something more about more middle-income whites who are scared to death of a few things. One is that the bottom is going to fall out for them, and the other is that the demographics of this country are going to change dramatically, which leads to my final point. To understand the Trump phenomena, to understand the fear in this election, we have to understand that the right-wing populism we're seeing is fundamentally a revolt against the future. It's fundamentally a revolt against the future.
Cleet, I gave your institutional affiliations with the Bishops' Conference, with Unite Higher, with Faith in Public Life. But more than anything else, you're a pastor. You were a Pope Francis priest before there was a Pope Francis. What is it in our tradition, in the principles of Catholic social thought, in the institutions of parishes and schools, in Catholic support for trade unions, and building bridges across racial and ethnic lines, that helps us analyze what we're talking about and might provide a way forward? Everybody talked about solidarity a little. The Pope said solidarity is our word. Some people don't like it. What does it mean that it's our word?
Well, I think, first of all, John, as you said, it's one of the fundamentals of our social doctrine. The fact that we are all in this together, that concept, the concept of a common good. And I think that's where I would like to start my remarks. I think that concept, more than anything, is under assault. And we live in a culture that is very consumerist. I'm saying this as a pastor, as a spiritual leader, but this is what I see. It's an exaggerated kind of individualism, what I get out of it. I'll give you an example. When they were doing the right to work vote in the state of Michigan, I remember seeing on the evening news an auto worker. And he said, well, I'm going to vote for the right to work law. You know, and I'm watching this amazed. And he says, because I don't get anything from my union. I pay dues and I don't get anything from my union. Of course, I'm screaming at the television. You know, you have safety on the job. You have a retirement plan. You have a health plan. You have weekends off. You've got overtime. And he's thinking individually, what do I get out of it? I think that question drives an awful lot. That is absolutely contrary to our concept of solidarity and the common good. During the last presidential debate, when the issue of paying taxes, and I'm a smart businessman because I didn't pay taxes, came up, he's not the only business person who was probably nodding their head saying, yeah, that's a smart business guy. You try not to pay taxes. What happens to the common good in that? And I want to say that is an epidemic mentality in our economic thinking right now. Everyone's trying to avoid paying taxes. Where is the common good? The second, there's the common good.
Would everyone please turn off their cell phone?
I'm glad it's a cell phone. It's like,
God help us. What do you say about family life?
yeah.
seems to be going very well.
I-
Would you please turn off your cell phones, and if you want to join us, faith vote at GUCST Public Life, and we'll find out what the problem was.
So, so John, I think that idea of the common good versus this individualism is something is really at the root of a lot of this. The second thing, when we're talking about the elites and that kind of thing, you know, both political parties are talking about college education. When you talk about working families, you don't hear any messaging about how about learning a trade? How about getting a union job? That's just not part of the conversation. And I think also then when you get into the communities in which I served, which were mostly immigrant, but overwhelmingly people of color, where one labor leader put it this way, and I saw this as a pastor, for particularly the male youth in those communities, he said their future looks like this. To the right is a gang, to the left is a life of drugs, and ahead of you is a job that comes with a hairnet. Not even college, not even a trades job. So the layers of inequality here, I think, are really significant, and race is a significant piece of this conversation. But the demographics also drive things. When you talk about the church as part of this, we're wrestling with that all the time. Our parishes, for generations, have been places for integration of immigrants. All across the country, we've done that. And then integrating different communities, different generations. But the demographics keep shifting on us. And I think that presents us with some significant challenges as well. And the population group we're talking about tonight are often the folks who didn't move. When folks moved out to the suburbs, in a number of our city parishes, the old ethnic parishes, they didn't move. Maybe they couldn't afford to move. But the neighborhood has changed. And people are at sea. And I think the church has a real challenge trying to hold those communities together in a culture that does not value community. I'll leave it at that.
Let me come back to you on that. When you think about our church, very often it's parishes in African American and white working class areas that are closed, schools that are closed. We used to be a church that was sort of paid for and funded by the small contributions of people in the pews. Increasingly, we rely on a fundraising strategy that relies on big gifts from the wealthy. You spend a lot of your life trying to build bridges between the church and working people. That's not the vocation of choice of a lot of priests. How do we rebuild a sense of community where lower income working class families of different races, and how do you handle the fact, I'll just be blunt, some, I would think, working class white and African American Catholics would say the church is in love with Latinos. What about us? They keep talking about the Latinos as the future. What about us?
Well, there's a lot there. So let me just try to answer a couple of things. I think, first of all, when we talk about schools, I heard nostalgia in your voice as you're talking about that. And I think it's important to recognize that for a lot of us, I think of myself growing up on the south side of Chicago, you know, we had 1,000 kids in our school, in our parish school. But that school system was run on the unpaid labor of women religious. Let's remember that. So for all the nostalgia, there were problems with that. Those women religious are not there today. So if we're going to maintain a school system, a private school system without government support, it's going to take a lot of money. And that presents its own kind of challenges. Our population, when I look at, again, the parish where I was a pastor. We had 500, 600 children in our parish school, mostly Mexican immigrants. There were 5 brand new public schools within a square mile of my parish. And for for parents looking at my old kind of building, it was an old ethnic parish, had been a Bohemian national parish that had become Mexican. And a little village, 26th Street, Chicago. And you know, when you saw the change, I mean, I could see why parents would want to go to the new school. They were beautiful new buildings. We couldn't afford to do that. So there were challenges in maintaining them. The other thing was we had a population that did not have a history of private schools in Mexico. And so it wasn't part of their worldview as they looked at that. So and then the challenge is, do we maintain a private school system for the wealthier people on 26th Street?
Wait
that could
a
come,
minute.
You know? So why do we do
I
it?
love you dearly. I live in Prince George's County.
Yeah.
Our school doesn't serve wealthy people. It
Yeah.
doesn't serve particularly Latinos who don't have a history. It is the alternative school for working class whites and African American families in a terrible school system.
Yeah, I agree.
And we're trying to make it go, and there's nothing nostalgic about that.
John, can I?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, one of the knocks on private school has long been how it's segregated and homogenous. I remember actually waiting in the car, and I had my 4-year-old in the back seat, picking up the older kids at school. And so instead of talking to my kid, I'm checking Twitter, of course. And so I find this article on Slate by this author saying only bad people send their kids to private school. So I read it because this is, you know, how I stoke up my anger and, you know, and corrupt my soul. And one of the things is about exactly how homogenous these schools are. And you got to send your kids to public school because they're more integrated. And as I'm in the middle of that sentence, my 4-year-old looking out the window at pickup at all the kids lining up says, "Daddy, how come at St. Andrews everybody else is brown?" And I laugh out loud and I look out the window. It's not true. We're about a third white, a third Hispanic, and a third everything else in the world. You go to some school districts in Montgomery County, guess what? You don't find that. Because what is more segregating than the fact that you have to be able to afford a house in Flower Valley to go to the Flower Valley public schools? Yet we had the black parish and the Hispanic parish next door to us closed down. We welcomed them with open arms. We were so excited. We love the multiculturalism, all of that. I think that the church, that the strength of the parish, that the strength of these civil society institutions that exist outside of government is essential to solidarity. And I think that government often undermines the solidarity, both through the fact that that public schools often work in this way where you don't have school choice. You have to be able to afford the house and the property taxes in the expensive district, and because government ends up sort of breaking up, displacing things like a parish that can form this solidarity. I'm very blessed to live in the St. Andrews Parish, which has sort of taken the curse of these two closing parishes and turned it into a blessing, where we now have sort of this, well, the parish schools, and turned it into this blessing. But that strength of civil society that still exists in some parishes, I think government, in a variety of ways, is a direct threat to that solidarity.
Father gets to defend himself, and then I'm going to Tom, and then back to Bill.
Well, just two other things I wanted to bring up. One, I really appreciate what you just said about the private schools. And I think that in many of our dioceses, we're maintaining those Catholic schools, even in areas where the student body is not Catholic, because of their value. And I think that's an important part of our mission. The second question you raised, John, was the attention to the Hispanic population, and just two statistics that are probably important. In the Catholic population in the United States right now, about 40% of it is Latino. People don't always get that picture. 46% of the Catholics under the age of 30 are Latino. 61% of Catholics under the age of 18 are Latino. And so that is a kind of a driving factor without being exclusive about other things.
Thomas, some people are going to elite white private schools, and they might be members of that meritocracy that you described. In your book and your several books, you've talked about the intersection of race, class, and education and politics. How do you sort that out?
Well, we're here at Georgetown. Let's talk about your most famous alum, Bill Clinton. Actually, no, let's not. I first want to bring up just kind of an amusing sort of story. We were talking about different places that journalists are describing this year, and I've done some of that as well. I actually wrote about Fall River, by the way. But the place that I really enjoyed writing about was Martha's Vineyard, where Bill Clinton and Barack Obama like to go on vacation. And it's a place where you're impressed. You get there and you're impressed by two things. First of all, the luxury of it and the affluence and all that hits you in the face. But then the virtue of it, the goodness of these people, the righteousness. It's striking, right? And it's everywhere, and it's obvious, and it's advertised, But this is not just, and in some ways, the kind of wealth that I'm describing is a return to a sort of Victorian understanding of wealth. It's a place where money and righteousness have come together, and people can feel really good about being plutocrats. Martha's Vineyard. Anyhow, so our Democratic presidents like to vacation there. Hillary herself likes to vacation there, and but we were going to talk about Bill Clinton, and you wanted to bring up
where the intersection of race and class?
Can I just give you one really just shocking, horrifying example that came up when I was writing Listen Liberal, and by the way, here it is. Excuse me.
Yeah. We can put it right.
So I was writing it, a year ago, right? And more than a year ago, a year and a half ago, and a big part of it reviews the presidency of Bill Clinton, okay, Georgetown alum, and I was going, and I didn't do it by reading like sort of the hate literature about Bill Clinton. There's this enormous literature that accuses him of these incredible crimes, being a drug dealer, being a murderer, all of this crazy stuff. I didn't use any of that. I read books by his admirers, books by his friends, and I tried to understand what they liked about Bill Clinton. Okay, and there's 5 things. The first one is NAFTA. This is his great achievement. Right? It's a fantastic achievement when he put the knife firmly between the ribs of his friends in organized labor. But the second one was the crime bill of '94. His admirers thought this was an amazing, wonderful deed. Okay? And I just couldn't, I'm reading these books from the 90s where the authors say things like this. I just couldn't believe it. I remembered it in such a horrifying way. This was a terrible thing that Clinton did. And there's many interesting aspects to this, but as we all know, this was one of the measures that brought mass incarceration to this country. I mean, mass incarceration was already going, but this really ramped it up. I mean, it did things like the number of federal death penalties went from 3 to 60. It prolonged the, we'll talk about the crack versus powder cocaine sentencing disparity, which was one of the measures in this bill, which, I just couldn't, I'll talk about it right now. I couldn't believe it when my memory was a little rusty about the 1990s, but it shocked me that Bill Clinton, who likes to go around the country, or liked at the time to go around the country deploring mass incarceration, then signed a measure ensuring that the 100-to-1 crack to powder cocaine sentencing disparity stayed on the books. If he had vetoed it, it would have been gone in 1995, but he signed it. I don't know what political victory he thought he was winning when he did that, but when he wrote his name on that piece of paper, he put a generation of kids in prison. The same time as he did that, he deregulated Wall Street. Okay, when he signed the original crime bill of '94, it was, I think, within a month of that, he signed the first of his big bank deregulation measures. And it's discipline for one class of Americans and complete freedom for another. The law is literally being rolled back for one group of Americans, and the state is just coming down with a sledgehammer on another group of Americans. And this was shocking to me when I realized how close in proximity these two events were. And this is what, if you want to understand the Democratic Party and who they are, you really have to start with this stuff. By the way, his other great achievements, I've mentioned 3 of them. The 4th one was welfare reform. I mean, his admirers at the time thought this was a fantastic deed, a great thing that Bill Clinton did. And the fifth one was a balanced budget. Now, what do you notice about all 5 of these things? They're all Republican measures. Every single one of them. Bank deregulation, NAFTA, crime bill, welfare reform, balanced budget, all of them are Republican measures. And 4 out of the 5 have been complete disasters, just complete crashing, utter failures, you know, for which the Clintons apologize and apologize and apologize. The fifth one, balanced budget, you know, you can argue that either way.
Bill, I don't know what you think of Martha's Vineyard, but you clearly are focused elsewhere. One of the things, I've just learned a little bit about your career, but you have built bridges and done the work of solidarity. You talked about white workers being afraid of the future and where America was going. I pressed Clint on the fear of Latinos. How do you get workers of whatever race to see each other as united and not focus on those beneath them or around them, but focused on those above them who have done so well, according to Thomas? How do you built bridges in solidarity all your life. How do we do that in this context?
Before I answer that, I just have to make a couple of other comments about some things that have come up, and we'll get into this. One of the things that affected me in the discussion when we were talking about education is that you can't talk about education in the United States without talking about housing segregation. You can't talk about it just at the level of income. So with all due respect, it's not that black folks can't afford to get into Montgomery County. We don't get the loans, right? We are, there is ample evidence of all kinds of redlining that's taken place that has had a profound effect in terms of segregating this country, and that then relates to what the schools look like. And then you add on to that, when you then have a depressed area, then you have lower tax base, because instead of funding education as a constitutional right, it's all handled at the state level. So we got some problems there. The second thing I just want to say, because I agree with a lot of what Thomas is raising, but this is where I might disagree. The Democratic Party has never been a workers' party, never. It's always been a capitalist-dominated party. It happened to have had, going back to the Civil War, post-Civil War, a substantial white working class base, which by the 1900s started to evolve and expand, but it was never a working class party. But there was a crisis that took place when the New Deal coalition itself started to break down, and what I think is being pointed to was the collapse of New Deal liberalism, the rise of political liberalism, the rise of neoliberal economics that the Democratic Party establishment ultimately agreed to, united with. And Bill Clinton was one of the foremost advocates. Now, one final point on this is that when we look at these kind of things that you were just saying in terms of Clinton, we have to understand that in the Democratic Party establishment, the great apparition is the Reagan Democrat. The idea that the Democrats lost all these white folks to the Republicans, and that we had to, as Democrats, figure out a way back. And basically that meant slowly but surely caving in on matters of race, in addition to various kinds of economic issues. And thus, you're right, that Clinton was actually to the right of Richard Nixon on domestic policy. Right? So as part of this overall strategy. So that was my background.
I was really going for hope there.
Yeah, but no, see, actually, I do have hope. But I actually am very optimistic. But my optimism is based on a necessity for a transformation both in the kind of union movement we have and the kind of politics that we have. I think that, for example, the Sanders campaign was pointing in the right direction, but had significant limitations, and those limitations really do relate to this question you're raising about solidarity. Because there is a current that exists, particularly among white progressives, that believes that a rising tide raises all boats. And it basically believes that if you just simply have wonderful structural reforms and everybody comes up, then everybody is happy because it's all hunky-dory. As opposed to understanding that the better metaphor is the Titanic. And the Titanic where
This
you
is
had
the hope
steerage.
part.
This is. But the hope begins with facing reality. That we have been living, many of us have been living in steerage, right? And when the ship is going down, there's some of us that are going to die. It is the way that the system is built. And that in order to have solidarity, the people that are in steerage cannot feel like the people that are in upper decks are basically saying, you know, stuff happens, too bad, right? There's got to be a willingness in the people on the upper decks, so-called, that are there to break those chains to help us get out of steerage. Solidarity doesn't happen when we just simply all join together for some happy future in which everyone is supposed to be in a better place. It happens when the people at the base feel that other folks understand the divisions of society. They understand that the racial differential that has existed in this country since the late 1600s, a racial differential that was constructed precisely to make sure the people at the bottom were divided up. The folks have to be convinced that there's a willingness to break that differential. I have to be concerned. I have to know that white workers, activists, others are as concerned about whether or not I will survive if I encounter police. I have to know that they are that concerned and that they will take up those issues, and not just that we will join together to raise wages. Solidarity, I mean, the experience of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, as successful as it was, points to that fact, that economic unity alone is not enough. We have to engage in a fight to break that racial differential. Otherwise, there is no hope. But I am convinced that it can and will be done, and some of that I saw in the excitement around Black Lives Matter and in the excitement around the Sanders campaign.
Great.
So that's why I've not taken the Kool-Aid.
Good. I was worried there for a minute.
Yeah,
Faith Vote, hashtag Faith Vote at GUCST Public Life. Tim, Thomas really took on the Clintons. You have been outspoken that Trump is not the answer to this. Why not?
So I guess I should start with what Trump opened my eyes to. Again, I probably wouldn't have gone.
Just one thing, we're going to go to questions, so if you want to get in line while Tim's answering, that would be a good thing.
I probably wouldn't have gone to Uniontown, Pennsylvania to better understand the electorate had it not been for Trump highlighting kind of how strong the populist fervor was. I think Trump's the wrong guy for a variety of reasons. In one, because his populism is entirely opportunistic in my view, that he was trying his best to fit into the elite class, feeling a bit spurned, and then saw a market opportunity, saw what the rest of the Republicans, so I'm now going to double answer your question, not only go after Trump, but go after the party that he hijacked. The rest of the Republicans didn't care about the bottom 47%. When Mitt Romney made his 47% comment, my first thought was, half of those people want to vote for you. Half of those people either want to be conservatives or are conservatives, and the Republicans weren't looking out for them because they were listening to K Street, the lobbying corridor, and the Chamber of Commerce. And so Trump showed me that, I was right to some extent to worry that the Republicans were listening to those, but on the other hand, that he wanted to be in that elite class. That is, he saw a market opportunity and he took it. And all his personal flaws, his treatment of women, all the other stuff that everybody knows, and we spent most of this last few weeks going over why he's not the guy. But more important than him not being the guy personally, I really do think that the response, that the populism on the right that's going to work, has to start by, to put it in an intentionally provocative way, scapegoating the right people. You don't scapegoat the Mexican family looking for a better life. You don't just scapegoat the Democrats or anything. You scapegoat the class that's in power. Frankly, a lot of what Thomas has been saying. The fact is that 5 of the 6 richest counties in America are within commuting distance of the U.S. Capitol. I don't think that's a sign of a healthy republic. I think that's a sign of a governmental class, not just the government employees, but the lobbyists, the hangers-on, who are extracting wealth from the rest of the country, and they're doing it by enriching themselves. And the Republicans say they believe in free enterprise, but then they give the big businesses the subsidies when they want it. Democrats say they're they're for the little guy, but then when big government is serving the big guy, they're on board with that too. So that's what I think Trump totally misses, is he's going after, when he's pointing to who's impoverishing the people who are being impoverished, first of all, he's not speaking to blacks and Hispanics who are being impoverished. Second of all, he's pointing to the wrong villains. He's pointing to the other people who are downtrodden instead of pointing, frankly, to the 6 counties surrounding us right now.
Great. Let's start over here. Please identify yourself and put your question in the form of a question.
I'll try to do that. Actually, I'm here to find a job, so if anybody's hiring,
Okay.
I'm the Rust Belt kid still unemployed, so come over to see me. My name's Tyler Bridge. I'm from Hamilton, Ohio, which was once hailed as one of the manufacturing capitals of the world, or at least all of us in Hamilton thought we were. But I actually have a question for all of us. And how many people, you don't have to answer, how many people in this room lived in, or does currently live in, what they would call a Rust Belt city? Okay, it's a healthy, not a healthy majority, but there's a couple people. And that's my question. What does that tell us about us? We can have this conversation at Georgetown, but we have 9 people in a room on a Tuesday that are from the Rust Belt, that know what it's like when a factory gets blown up. And what does that say? That 9 people in the Georgetown auditorium are from the Rust Belt. What do you think the other top 25 schools look like too? What does that say about the top 25 institutions of higher learning in America? When I'm the only kid from Butler County, Ohio, when there is one kid I know at Georgetown from West Virginia. Mm-hmm. And that's my question for you.
Well, Thomas, you've talked about the way education stratifies us and separates us. Okay.
I was all set to tell stories about my days in the south side of Chicago. My state senator
One
was
story and one
my state senator was
answer.
a man
Yeah.
called Barack Obama, and I used to go to thrift stores in your neighborhood, and I would. I'm sorry. I don't know where to begin with this.
His question was, how do we talk about people who aren't in a place like this? When you talk about the meritocracy, that all go to the right schools, get the right grades, know each other.
This is one of the most maddening things about Washington D.C. is that I've written a book about I wrote about Kansas, for God's sake, so the state that I come from, or you write tell stories about the lives of all the people that we've been talking about, and it's just it is a completely alien experience for the kind of people that I live among. Okay, so I wrote about them. This is about the people in Bethesda, and it's about the people in the 6 counties that we've been talking about, and trying to understand the way they look at the world. But you're absolutely right. I mean, look, try selling this stuff to NPR. They want to talk about working class people as exotics, that sort of thing. But the one thing they will not do, also, by the way, is look in the mirror in a critical way. They see themselves as beyond criticism.
Bill?
I guess I wanted to just add that what we have to have a discussion about race and about capitalism in the United States. And one of the things that we've got to talk about in terms of capitalism, when we're talking about these cities, these so-called Rust Belt cities, there's been an evolution of capitalism in which those cities and the people that worked and died and built those are irrelevant to capitalism. Capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, proves itself once again to be a completely amoral system and continues to crush people. And that's one of the things that many working class people have had a great deal of difficulty accepting. They in part because they made the sacrifices. The people that I used to work with in the shipyard, people that worked in factories, that made immense sacrifices and thought that there was some sort of loyalty that existed. There is no loyalty. The loyalty is, no, excuse me, there is. The loyalty is to the Yankee dollar. That is the loyalty. And that's the discussion that I would say I'm so critical about the labor movement failing to have with working class people. Failing in part because of the fear of being charged of being communist. Instead of saying right out to people that yes, you are being crushed by a system that doesn't give a damn about you. That's a discussion that we have to have. And that takes us away from the Trump insanity. It takes us away from the right-wing populism that starts blaming Jews and immigrants and others. That's the discussion that we need to have, and that will be a unifying discussion.
Pope Francis talks about an economy of exclusion and says this economy kills, which is a different way. Over here.
Good evening. My name is Dan, and I'm curious. I've lived up and down both coasts, and often it seems to me a conversation like this gets couched in terms of left and right. That's been the case in this discussion. Sometimes I wonder, is it more appropriate to couch it in terms of like national versus local? And in terms of, building community, in particular, gentleman on my left, working through mediating civil institutions, I would be curious, what have you seen the church and the churches ecumenically doing at the local level? Because sometimes I feel like, everybody's got an opinion about Common Core or Brexit or whatever, but if the churches really wanted to move the needle, if only a quarter of the clergy in my town showed up at like a city planning, zoning meeting, school board meeting, chamber of commerce meeting, they would move the needle on these issues for local people. So I'm curious as to what you have seen the churches do, what you think they could do in that regard.
How about Tim and Clayton?
I'm really glad you asked that question, and I'll let Father Clee answer for the Catholic Church, because sadly what I've seen when I've looked for good functioning communities has been communities driven by other churches besides their own. It's not sad, it's happy to see it. I just wish it were my own church. So when I have to pick a county to go to, I look for some number I can see externally to go to. And I found the town in Wisconsin that was the highest percentage Dutch population, because I had seen that Dutch population was inversely proportional to Trump support in the primaries. And my quick back of the envelope calculation was, maybe people in these Dutch towns are just happier. I'm going to find out why. And Oostburg is 40% Dutch or 30% German. And when you show up there, there's 4 different Dutch Reformed churches. I didn't know anything. As an ignorant Catholic, I thought Christian Reformed Dutch and Dutch Reformed were the same church. But no, they were 2 different churches, and this was a whole population. One of the complaints, and the guy inadvertently quoted Robert Putnam, he said, I couldn't get into, what I don't like about Oostburg, I couldn't get into my kids' Christmas concert because I showed up and the whole gym was filled. There were even people there who didn't have kids at the school. And I shouted to my neighbor, Joey, why are you taking up my seat? He said, I had to see our kids. Our kids. They consider them their kids. And then I went to Salt Lake City and saw the Mormons. And the way they have their welfare system set up on the parish, they call them wards, by the parish by parish, ward by ward level, where somebody actually comes to your house and says, this is what you need. Oh, wait, what do you need? And the whole parish is obligated to take care of you. This was subsidiarity, solidarity, all that stuff together. They didn't use that language, but it was there. And I talked to what they used to call the Gentiles, the non-LDS people there, and they said, sometimes they're a little exclusionary, but I find they're very welcoming. I find that I myself am thinking about my poor neighbors more because these people all around. It's just exuding, it's trickling up, it's trickling out of the parishes into the rest of Salt Lake City that I saw there. And that's what I've seen in the other churches that's made me think this really can be done.
It's a great question. I think that, speaking as a Roman Catholic, I think we've lacked the leadership in many places to be organized. I think we're seeing some changes in different places, and Pope Francis has said to us the church is meant to be a field hospital, not to be putting customs booths at the front doors of our churches. I think as we've gotten caught over the years, maybe the last decade or so, in culture wars, and thinking we want a pure, leaner, smaller church. As Pope Francis said, we become more like a sect. When our mentality is that we're in the world, and as my Archbishop said in Chicago, speaking to a number of civic groups, said, this ought to be a better, stronger city and community because we're here. He didn't say purer or holier or all Catholic. He said this city should be a better city because we're in it. And I think the kind of engagement we're called to right now is really important. We've been identifying a core group of priests around the country. People said, well, priests weren't involved with labor anymore. I'm like, well, yeah, they are interested. We're just not organized. And one of the other things that Pope Francis said, it's the people's ability to organize that is going to change the kind of situations that we have. So I think where we're engaged with the broader community, not afraid to be contaminated by working with folks and coalitions, I think great change can occur.
Nobody asked me the question, but permit me to. What the Mormons are doing sounds a lot like St. Vincent de Paul in my parish. I think there are a lot of people doing a lot of stuff, and we may not get the publicity. Catholic Campaign for Human Development invests $10 million a year in faith-based organizing that has made a big difference in a lot of places. So we'll take tours of different people's realities. So let's go over here.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Anjali Walker-Smith. I'm with Bread for the World.
Yay.
Pan-African and Orthodox Church engagement. So I have 3 parts to one question. There are some perspectives I haven't heard at all this evening. Maybe I just wasn't listening, but I just wanted to make sure that I get some comment about it. And one is, I know we've already apologized for not having any gender perspectives on here, but my perspective is that men need to have a gender perspective relative to women as well. So I would like to know what yours is, or to at least speak to that for a moment relative to the comments you've already made. And then there are 2 other populations, one of them, well, 2 of them actually coming right out of what the young man just said about Butler County. I come from Clark County, just down the road, and had the same experience, so thank you, Ohioan. But there are 2 communities that were very important in the communities I grew up in Springfield, Ohio, and that is Appalachia and also sharecropping communities. And I haven't heard anything about Appalachia or sharecropping communities relative to these issues we're talking about around class. And I'd like to hear something more about that. My last part has to do with the Sustainable Development Goals, which of course we're very strong on at Bread for the World. And of course the Sustainable Development Goals have a domestic side as well as a global side. How do you see the SDGs feeding into your conversation this evening? Thank you.
So take your pick. Sustainable Development Goals, gender, or sharecroppers and Appalachia.
Yeah. You know, it was, I want to take this issue of the gender perspective. So the framework I operate within is that the capitalist system under which we live, there's 2 central components that help to sustain it, and one is race and the other is patriarchy, and male supremacy, however you want to define it. And that what's interesting, though, I mean, these things end up intersecting. And one of the things that's interesting about this particular election season is that the misogyny that we've seen, many people are acting as if this is new and not looking at the fact that that this has been it is both a national as well as an international phenomenon. It's a phenomena that to a great extent is linked to both a pushback on the victories of the women's movement, but it's also related to a problem facing declassed men. And I don't mean that in a moral sense. I mean men that are being pushed out of the economy, whether it's here or whether you see it in other parts of the world, who are then turning their ire against women. And so one of the things when Trump and others are engaged in this misogyny, it's not just insulting women. It's not just insulting Hillary Clinton. It's not just insulting women more generally. He is, in fact, channeling this right-wing populist hatred of women and of a desire to reinforce patriarchy. That has gotten very little discussion in this election season. We're treated to very correct criticisms of Trump for his insults to women, but we're not looking at the deeper things. I mean, one of the things I was thinking about, actually, as the panel was engaged in this discussion, was that when Reagan went after created the image of the welfare queen, that was not viewed as an attack on women. That was viewed as an attack on black folks. And the fact that it wasn't viewed as an attack on women shows you the way that this racial division plays itself out even among women and in the women's movement. And that people were willing to sit back and basically say, no, that's not an attack on women, that's just an attack on black folks. And now the chickens have come home to roost. That's what we're seeing in this current incarnation of right-wing populism.
I don't know, I'm not going to address the issue, but I do know one of the facts that's just stunning, and I think others probably have referred to it as well, that we've always known the life expectancy for African Americans and Latinos in our country trailed whites. But they were gradually getting better, even though the gap still awful. What we're experiencing now is life expectancy for working class whites is actually going down, especially white women. And it's not some new illness. It's despair. It's suicide. It's substance abuse. And you know, the public health people say this just doesn't happen. But in fact, because of the factors we're talking about tonight, life expectancy in the United States for working class people is going down instead of up, especially for women. Can we take 2 questions at once over here? And let's start over here, 2 questions over here, and then we'll try and respond, and then we'll wrap up.
Sure. My name is Sarah, and I actually have 2 questions, so I hope you'll let him speak as well. My first question is, what are your hopes for a reinvigorated labor movement, perhaps arising out of the Fight for 15? I haven't heard anything about that tonight. My second question is, how do we create workplaces that not only pay living wages, but that are also supportive of families and that create places where people have the time off to be engaged in their communities? Because if you work 90 hours a week, minimum wage, you aren't going to be able to participate in those kind of civil society institutions that he's talking about.
Bill is going to need to slip away to be on a program. So what's a reinvigorated labor movement look like?
It's an audacious movement. It's a movement that holds social justice at its core. It is not just mobilization, but see, one of the things that we have to understand is that people's living standards increased in the period after World War II, not simply because of the positioning of the U.S. vis-a-vis other capitalist economies, but because of the strengths of unions. And this is a factor that many, many people have forgotten, that the deunionization has been directly corresponds to the declining living standard. And so, there is an interest that working class people have in unions. But in order for us to rebuild, it's going to necessitate a rethinking of what it means to be in a union. When we have a situation where you have Uber, who's the employer? When you have a situation where these companies have a credible threat that they can close down, what do? I mean, once upon a time when you had a huge auto factory of thousands of people, it was very unlikely it was going to shut down. But with changes in technology, what does that mean? So a lot of what we have to do to reinvigorate is really to rethink unionism. We have to rethink its objectives. We have to rethink the way it organizes, including organizing people in some ways back to the future, much as was done in the 19th century through groups like the Knights of Labor, organizing people in their communities. But when I said audacious, the union movement's failure to be honest with its members about the nature of the system in which we live has haunted us. I know this because I was directly involved in the AFL-CIO when we started to talk about the economy in the 1990s, right? This was a major breakthrough because there was a reluctance, there was this belief that actually there was some sort of partnership between workers and capital, and that this partnership could last on and on. The only partnership that existed was the partnership between a human and a horse. And we were the horse, and we were being ridden until we collapsed. And this is something that the labor movement refused to speak about. And I think that ends up being a problem, and we have to move away from that if we're going to revitalize and give workers a hope, even workers that are not going to join a union, but are going to say, this is us. Unfortunately, I have to run. Thank you.
Okay, how about these two, and then we'll come back here?
Yeah, real quick. I'm Dan Allett. I'm a colleague of Tim's. Thomas, you mentioned mass incarceration, and the U.S., many of you probably know, has the largest prison population in the world, 25% of the world's prison population, and yet only 5% of the world's population in general. So I'm wondering, with so many people affected, not just prisoners, but their families, ex-prisoners, so we've got 10, 20, 30 million people directly affected by mass incarceration. What role do you think criminal justice reform can play in helping to rebuild some of these communities?
Great. And the person behind you, if you would share your question, and we'll try and respond to both at once.
Sure. Hi. First of all, I'd like to apologize for my voice. I'm a little sick. My name is Esme Huerta. I'm a senior in the SFS. And I wanted to ask about when we're having these conversations, it often seems like the policies and structures that we're talking about are very removed from us. But in fact, we're often complicit in them ourselves or happen to form a part of these structures. So I wanted to bring to example Georgetown University negotiating with facilities workers right now, and facilities workers asking for fair raises and better healthcare, things like that. Georgetown only willing to give 2%, which would essentially make them poorer off than before, given DC's rising inflation and rising healthcare costs. So my question is, what responsibility does Georgetown, religious institutions, and higher ed institutions have to its own working class?
Okay, so criminal justice and practice what you preach.
I think I can give an answer that ties in prison, the working place that values employees, and a lot of it has to do with alienation. That what gave rise to the labor union movement, and I criticize labor unions a lot, but a lot of it was a reaction to the idea of Turnerism, the idea that you should treat workers as sort of interchangeable parts in a machine, and then the labor union reaction often was, well, we're going to sign this contract and we're going to work to the letter of the law. So you have employers treating their workers as machine parts, and workers treating their bosses as sort of enemies, which maybe they were, but that's not going to be a place where anybody is treated with respect as a human being. That lacks the solidarity that you need, and the same thing happens in prison. These people are explicitly alienated from their community and while in prison, and not only sort of left behind, but actually taught antisocial behaviors. That prison is a place where solidarity is, in a lot of prisons, explicitly, maybe you join a gang, but you don't say hi to somebody. I mean, that's the worst thing you can do. If somebody gives you a minor slight and you let it go by, well, that's the worst thing you can do. So within prisons, there is a prison code which is antisocial. Within some labor union, private sector workplaces, it has been explicitly antisocial. And the fact is that a lot of this is centralization. The more things are done on a massive level, the harder it is for people to interact on a human level. I think that centralization of government power has made the welfare state more asocial and antisocial. I think that centralization of economic power has made the workplace more asocial and antisocial. So finding a way to reverse that centralization is a way to return things to a human level, both in the workplace and as far as helping people who are returning from prison.
I think you might agree on prisons and not on unions being antisocial.
Can I, oh,
Do you want to jump in?
yeah, I don't know if my microphone, it still works. I want to pile on Georgetown a little more, because I think the complicity is grander than, you know, the particular showdown between Georgetown and its workers, which is between the university system and working class people generally. One of the sort of traits of the professional class that I write about in Listen Liberal is the conviction, the idea that, I mean, the faith, that every economic problem is really an educational problem. And that when, you know, people, you know, they're not doing well out in the south side of Chicago, or their lives are falling apart in Fall River, we often, you know, we nice liberals look at them and say, well, you know, it's because they didn't go to school. They didn't finish high school, or they didn't go to college, or maybe they did go to college, but they didn't go to the right college. And they didn't study the right subject. Everybody knows you have to get a STEM degree, right? And they didn't do it. And so, but what you see what I'm getting at here, that the way we understand education and the way we talk about it, and it often seems so noble and so wonderful. You know, you have a guy like Tom Friedman talking about how we have the most wonderful higher education system in the world here in the United States, but the direction that argument takes you in is ultimately to blame the victim. That people, you know, what's happening to them is essentially their own doing, because they didn't try hard in school, they didn't get the gold star from their teacher, and they didn't make the right choices. And it's just a different way of pushing the blame back on them. And higher ed, well, has a lot of, it perpetuates inequality in all sorts of other ways as well. One that I love to talk about is student debt. But I'm not going to do that now because we're almost out of time. We're just getting started.
I want to just respond to you real quickly. I think you just saw the future of the labor movement right here in the question of the student. This is the kind of movement that the labor movement has to begin to turn into. What you did is you see these workers here as members of your community. They're not just add-ons. They're not just robots that are sweeping the floors or something. They're part of the Georgetown community. Georgetown, I'm aware of, has a just workplace statement, which is extraordinary, and became familiar with that a few years ago when the food service workers here were organizing. And I first heard about the food service organizing from Georgetown students, because they saw those workers as part of their daily community. They were not atomized off as some other thing. And that's solidarity. That's what we're talking about. Today or yesterday at Harvard, 750 workers have been on strike for 3 weeks. We're about to begin a fast. 500 students boycotted their classes, joined those workers. They took over Harvard Square, stopped traffic, sat in the administration building while the workers picketed outside. And today they have an agreement. And I think that's what the labor movement looks like in the future. It's part of the community.
Can I just build on that? I don't know the specifics of this agreement. I'm hopeful, as many people are, that our continued record of reaching mutually agreeable agreements holds up. But Georgetown didn't fight adjuncts organizing like a lot of other colleges. At our, it's the Economy Synod, we had Tarshay, I forget her last name, told the story of having a health emergency, going to the hospital, calling in and being told she might lose her job. She's working the cashier down at the cafeteria, we don't call it that anymore. And a student says, "What's wrong?" And she said, "I got sick and I might lose my job." And the student said, "What are you going to do about that?" And she said, "I don't know what I can do." And the student said, if you will stand up for yourself, I will stand with you and I will get other people to stand with you. And she said this was the struggle. She got students, faculty, Jesuits, administrators, and now there's an agreement, and now there's a negotiation, and hopefully they'll reach an understanding.
And if I might add, Tarshay is now a full organizer for the union of going around the country because she is a leader who was visible and emerged in that kind of struggle. That's
Okay.
the future of the labor movement.
One more.
Hi, my name is Vincent. I'm a senior here at Georgetown. And my question is that we've talked a lot tonight about like a politics of solidarity that emerges from Catholic social thought and what it means for the working class. But I think we've relied like kind of on a convenient construction of what the working class is, like particularly a typically white deindustrialized male who's lost their job at a factory. But what does Catholic social thought and this politics of solidarity have to offer people who exist in the more like subaltern parts of the American working class, particularly those who have faced brutalization at the hands of the Catholic Church in the past? So people like transgender sex workers or a heroin-addicted single mother. What does this kind of rhetoric offer them? And how does the Catholic Church and Catholic social thought plan to reach them, particularly when they're recovering from the trauma of a really non-inclusive church?
Again, I would go back to Pope Francis's image of the church being a field hospital. And if we're not there for those folks, we're not anywhere. So I think, you know, it's taken some effort to take this ship and turn it around. But if we're not a field hospital, if we're not present there, we don't have any credibility. That's where we have to be.
And I think that's where we leave it. We have to practice ourselves what we preach to others, and our credibility depends on it.